There is a man with the power of a god, but with the emotional detachment of a machine. He can see everything, do the impossible, and yet he questions if humanity deserves to be saved. How does someone like that become the center of a story about justice, power, and destiny? Welcome to the movie Watchmen. The film takes place in a fictional era between the 1930s and 40s. A dedicated group of masked vigilantes called the Minutemen appear in response to criminal activity and dedicate themselves to combating various forms of injustice. However, for various reasons, the group is gradually diminished over time and ends up disintegrating, leaving control of the city to the local police force. Several years later, a new generation of superheroes, now called watchmen, vigilantes, is established to work actively in society. However, politician Richard Nixon, now the president, after using them to win the Vietnam War, enacts the Keene Act, a law that makes costumed heroes illegal, and consequently, the group finally retires from its self-appointed duty. The film begins one night with an elderly man named Edward Blake, who is in his apartment watching a movie on television when a stranger breaks into his home with the intention of killing him. Blake, who seems to be quite familiar with the subject, faces him in a violent but truly extraordinary combat. Yet he remains unable to defeat him even with his various weapons. A pistol, which the intruder quickly snatches from him after the very first shot, and his set of sharp kitchen knives which he throws and uses as daggers without ever wounding his opponent. Finally, the intruder ultimately defeats Blake and throws him through a thick glass window, which shatters, causing his immediate death. The police arrive at the apartment and, after investigating, conclude it was a robbery, although two of the supervising detectives suspect there is something more after seeing a photo of Blake greeting the president. Later that same night, Rorschach, the last active vigilante outside the law, quietly breaks in to investigate and discovers a hidden secret closet in the wardrobe where there is an arsenal, a photo of the Minutemen, and a well-known battlesuit. Rorschach discovers that Edward Blake was the hero known as the Comedian and a member of the Minutemen and the Vigilantes, Watchmen. Daniel Dryberg, who was the vigilante hero Night Owl and a friend of Rorschach, lives his life with a certain kind of emptiness and disappointment, missing being a hero but refusing to admit it. Now he only visits his predecessor and also friend Hollis Mason, the first Night Owl. After making one of his visits, Dryberg returns home, discovering Rorschach in the kitchen. He tells him what happened with Blake, that he believes it is a hit against the masked ones and that he is willing to investigate the death of his former partner. Rorschach heads to the highly secure military research facility where his former masked vigilante colleagues Laurie Juspecic and John Osterman are living, hoping to persuade them to return and protect themselves from the looming and supposed threat. But they, like Dryberg, reject the offer, each believing they lead a normal lifestyle, just like Dryberg, when in truth, it is full of problems and complications. Laurie regrets having lived as a heroine and having become the second Silk Spectre at the request of her mother, Sally Jupiter, who was the first. Meanwhile, John is gradually starting to lose his humanity and empathy for those around him, partly because he's the only member of his team with powers that make him a kind of demigod. In response, his relationship with Laurie grows cold and ends in the worst possible way. On the day of Blake's funeral, Daniel, John, Adrian, and an aging Sally Jupiter recall their relationship with the comedian and the influence he had on them. Daniel vividly remembers the last time he fought alongside Blake while trying to calm a large crowd of protesters, which ended with the comedian brutally beating and attacking people to kill, only to complain that he, the American dream, had finally come true. John recalls the fighting in Vietnam and the end when he witnessed Blake shoot and kill a young pregnant Vietnamese woman because she slashed his face with a bottle when he confessed he was leaving her, though he seems somewhat guilty for what he's done in the war. Adrian remembers Blake's sociopathic attitude during a meeting of the Watchmen. In the midst of the investigation, Rorschach begins to suspect William Edgar Jacoby, Moloch the Mystic, a former supervillain and enemy of Blake, who mysteriously attended his funeral. The former antagonist justifies himself by claiming that Blake broke into his home a few days before his death, drunk and crying, as if trying to redeem himself, and also reveals to him that he has cancer. In an interview with Dr. Manhattan, a journalist begins to accuse him of causing cancer in a series of people who were close to him, including his ex-girlfriend, Janie Slater. Feeling responsible for condemning the ones he loved most, John exiles himself from Earth and goes to Mars, where after recalling his entire life up to his transformation into Dr. Manhattan and his participation in the Vietnam War, the Superman creates a complex crystal system resembling the internal mechanism of a clock. Back on Earth, Dan and Laurie, after a meeting, begin a romantic relationship while Adrian is attacked by a hitman whom he manages to stop. In search of new answers, Rorschach looks for Moloch again, but to his surprise, he finds that he has been murdered. The police appear, believing the hero is the murderer. Rorschach confronts the police in an attempt to escape, but is detained in jail, blamed for Moloch's murder, and subjected to various psychological tests where he recalls his violent childhood up to his transformation into the bloodthirsty Rorschach. The presence of the bloody vigilante causes a violent riot in the prison, sparked by Big Figure, a mob boss seeking revenge on him. After much thought and missing it, Dan and Laurie put on their old suits and go out on patrol like in the old days, managing to rescue some civilians from a fire. Afterwards, they have sexual relations on the ship Archimedes. Shortly after, the two begin to believe their partner Rorschach's theory and head to the prison to break him out. At that moment, the riot has broken out, so the two heroes face numerous opponents, defeating them. Before fleeing the prison, Rorschach kills Big Figure. Manhattan takes Laurie to Mars, explaining that nothing on Earth matters to him anymore. There they discover the comedian was Sally Jupiter's lover and Laurie's biological father. Meanwhile, Night Owl and Rorschach discover that the one responsible for everything is Adrian Veidt, Ozymandias, who killed Blake to protect his plans, staged his own assassination, and framed Rorschach for Moloch's death. They head to Antarctica to face Veidt, but Rorschach is quickly defeated. Night Owl, despite having similar martial arts skills, is no match for Ozymandias and is also defeated. Veidt confesses his master plan: launch a nuclear attack on several major cities to mimic Manhattan's power in order to create a fake war between the world and the powerful hero. And in that way, all of humanity would forget their differences and begin to work together without a single internal war. Shocked the sinister plan was already executed, everyone, including Dr. Manhattan, decides to stay silent about Ozymandias' false utopia, except for Rorschach, who remains attached to his ideals. Manhattan, knowing he can't let Rorschach confess, speaks with him, and Rorschach, willing to die, lets Manhattan disintegrate him. Manhattan decides to leave Earth forever and says goodbye to Laurie. Dan, who had witnessed Rorschach's death, furiously attacks Adrian, beating him until he's exhausted, but finally leaves with Laurie, leaving Adrian to his fate. A few days later, Dan and Laurie continue their relationship, and the world becomes a more peaceful place for the first time in centuries. In another part of the city, a reporter is looking for work to create the most interesting report in history, but he can't reconcile the different notes that come to him. Desperate, the man asks his assistant to look for a good story in the mail, where he finds Rorschach's journal, which contains all the hero's research from the death of Edward Blake, the comedian, to his suspicions and conclusions about Adrian and his sinister plan. Watchmen isn't about superheroes, it shows powerful people and the consequences of unchecked power. Zack Snyder poses an uncomfortable question: what if our supposed protectors are actually just following their own interests? The film confronts us with a world where justice is manipulable, truth is distorted, and peace is achieved at a cost that no one dares to look at head-on. And the most unsettling thing is that we're not that far from it, because in the end, Watchmen doesn't talk about a dystopian future. It talks about the present, about us, about what happens when fear, power, and lies mix, and no one dares to ask questions. Sometimes the real danger isn't the villains, but the heroes we stop questioning.